And when Paul says, look, you should show meekness towards all people, what he's saying is that you should give conspicuous proof. You should give undeniable evidence of who you are and what's going on inside you. This is really the summary of all the other commands, that in word and in deed, right, our lives would give conspicuous proof of who Jesus is and what he has done for us. In other words, that we would reciprocate the grace and kindness and mercy and love that has been shown to us. One of my favorite passages in the New Testament, if you've been around, you've heard me quote it multiple times, is the book of Romans, chapter 5, verse 8. Paul writes this. He says, but God shows his love for us in that while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. Not when you got things right did Christ die for you. Not when you were perfect, not when you were nice, not when you were godly, but when you were still a sinner, Christ died for you. He goes on in verse 10 and says, for if while we were enemies, we were reconciled to God by the death of his son, much more now that we are reconciled shall we be saved by his life. In other words, Paul says we should be enemies of God, and yet he has shown kindness and grace and love for us. We should be enemies of God, he says, and yet he has brought peace and reconciliation to us. We should be enemies of God, and yet, Paul says, God has given forgiveness and redemption and restoration to us. We should be enemies of God, and yet, through Jesus Christ, friendship and adoption as sons and daughters have been offered to us. That is an incredible thing. And if you're here today or you're watching this online and you have never had a moment where you've admitted and said, Jesus, I know that I'm a sinner. I know that I've said things and I've done things and I've thought things that weren't right. And God, I know that nothing I do can make me right with you. And I believe that Jesus, you're God's son. I believe that you came and you lived a perfect life and you gave your life on the cross for me and you rose 3 days later that I could live with God forever in heaven. And Jesus, I need you to be my Lord and my Savior. If you've never had that moment, I don't care how long you've gone to church. I don't care how spiritual you may be. Then you don't know the grace that calls us to submit, the grace that calls us to serve, the grace that makes us gentle, the grace that calls us to walk with meekness in this life, and you need it. And so would you accept that today? Would today be the day that you say, Jesus, I need you to be my Lord and Savior?